Welcome to the Disability and podcast, bringing together thoughtful discussion and debate. This month, Paul Wilshaw chats with CEO and Artistic Director James Brining and Deputy Artistic Director Amy Leach of Leeds Playhouse about their inclusive policies, their engagement with Ramps on the Moon, and how they dealt with the first COVID lockdown.
Hello, listeners, and today we have James Brining and Amy Leach from Leeds Playhouse. Thank you very much for coming on to the Disability and podcast.
You're very welcome,
Yeah,
Paul.
great to be here.
Exciting to be here.
Great. Can you tell us a bit about your job and what you do at the Playhouse? Go with James first.
Okay, well, I've got two titles. I'm the Chief Executive and I'm also Artistic Director. So as Chief Executive, my responsibility is to have an overview of the whole organisation, although there's lots of brilliant people who actually do the work to make the theatre run and make sure it's safe and sustainable, and everybody here is working well and happy, and the audiences and people we work with who come into the theatre. And then Artistic Director, I work with Amy really closely to sort of select the shows that we make, the artists who make that work, and the work that comes into the theatre, which we don't make ourselves.
And Amy.
Yes, and my job is that I'm the Deputy Artistic Director. And I suppose, I support James in delivering on the artistic vision of the theatre. And that's everything from, again, directing and working on shows and the programming of the theatre. But I also lead on Furnace, which is all of our artistic development programme here at the Playhouse. And also over the last few years, I've kind of really driven forward in terms of access and working with disabled artists and thinking about creative access as well at the theatre.
Brilliant. Talking around access and all the great work that Leeds Playhouse does with disabled audiences in mind and our staff. What's driven getting disabled audiences and staff into the Playhouse?
There's a couple of things from my point of view to sort of say, I suppose, to start. One is that I think this theatre, the Playhouse, has always been based on the notion of a theatre for the people of Leeds. And so when the theatre was set up in 1970, that was in the DNA. And I think back then it was more driven by, I suppose, a sense of social equality and the sense of anybody, wherever they were from in the city, being able to have access. But over the years, that's developed and become more refined and more informed by practice and partners across the sector. So I think in that what you just described, Paul, is in terms of disabled people and disabled artists, is driven by that desire to be as inclusive as possible, not just audiences, but actually people who are making and leading work. And then on a personal level, my own experience of this, I used to work in Dundee and I encountered a number of people, including Grey Eye's work and Jenny Seeley bringing Reasons to be Cheerful, which led in a way to Ramps on the Moon project, and also disabled dancers within Scottish Dance Theatre like Caroline Bowditch and Mark Brew, whose practice was really driving forward the dance sector, I think. So I came to Leeds about 10 years ago with a sense of the importance of this as part of a theatre, a sort of large-scale theatre's practice. But it's Ramps on the Moon, and particularly Amy joining, and also some existing things like the innovation of relaxed performances and a lot of the work we've done around people living with dementia that have sort of contributed to a real focus on this area of making work led by disabled people, making disabled people in terms of audiences have genuine opportunities to experience great theatre.
Absolutely. I think, like James really brilliantly described, is the kind of the DNA of this organisation as being one that has wanted to serve the city and its people. And I think, again, it felt like maybe before the Ramps on the Moon project kind of started, that there'd been such a lot of work happening, but in a more participatory way. And one of the things that drew me to want to work at this theatre kind of full time was about the kind of the brilliant, I suppose, community focus and civic focus practice of this theatre, which I think is really special. And I think that's always been there, as James described. And I think what's been really exciting about the Ramps project is how that's shifted into also thinking about the professional artists who are working with us, thinking about how access can be there not just as a kind of additional access feature, but actually absolutely part of the DNA of the art. And I think that's been really, really exciting for kind of a large scale kind of, in inverted commas, mainstream theatre to really think about what is the creative potential of working with disabled artists, thinking about access in a creative way. And I think that's the journey we've been on more recently. It feels like it's building, but also expanding that. So actually those progression routes, those career paths for disabled artists are there, so that the work that we make is as accessible as possible, but in a really exciting way, not just because it's good to do. And I think that's been a really exciting part of the journey. I've particularly found that really personally, creatively fulfilling.
So I also work for Mind the Gap, but I work here at the Playhouse as Ramps on the Moon agent for change. And it's definitely been an experience and an eye-opener for me in terms of access and inclusion at the Playhouse, and the stuff that we are doing really well, learning from other theatres and other agents for change, and also things that we can improve on.
One of the really kind of massive kind of byproducts, I suppose, of the Ramps on the Moon involvement and this last 7 years is that the more that we've considered access from a kind of disability point of view, the more that actually we're just improving the environment, the working conditions for everybody. So that diversity of thought, diversity of people coming in with different experiences of life, different outlooks has just been so fantastic to kind of expand. So actually we might change something because it's going to really help a disabled person, but actually it has a massive knock-on effect on everybody. So that's felt really exciting.
I would like to go back to the relaxed performances because I think Leeds was probably one of the leading founders of relaxed performances from what I understand.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly just when I arrived here, which is 2012, I think it was either the year or 18 months before that we did our first relaxed performance on the production of Cinderella in the Courtyard. And I believe that it was the first relaxed performance that had taken place anywhere in the UK. I think the RSC started doing them around about the time, but certainly what I've been told is that we started that off. Now, you have to talk to the RSC about whether they agree with that or not. But that came, as Amy said, that came out of working with learning disabled young people and wanting to make the work that we were creating and producing on stage accessible to the young people we were working with through our participatory program. So it kind of came about through need, really, rather than a sense of, we need to do that because that's the right thing to do. I mean, it is the right thing to do, but I think that's why it kind of feels like it's an authentic evolution of what we were doing. And the work we've been doing in that area for a number of years has been really exemplary, but also quite hidden and quite small, almost by necessity, because those rooms are often, they need to be particularly safe, and the work is not for great volumes of people. And it's also not the kind of thing that is necessarily publicised much. So I think that the work we've been doing for a number of years leading up to that had been really great and thorough and had led to relaxed performances. And since then, we've done them, ever since then for an increasing number of shows.
Yeah, it's interesting around relaxed performances because everyone seems to have a different notion of what a relaxed performance actually is. And talking about that, I find like some theatres will say that it's just lights going up and music being tempered down. Can you tell me a bit about your experience of disability arts in general, and also where do you see it in terms of the Playhouse on our stages? And we've got the Ramps on the Moon project, which is great, but what are your feelings around disability arts in general?
Big question.
Big question. I mean, maybe we'll sort of go back and forward on this, but I mean, one thing that Amy said, which really resonates with me, is the idea that the work becomes much more interesting when it is inclusive and when people, say disabled people, for instance, are given the opportunity and given the platform and given the circumstances where they can make brilliant work. Those stories that are often not particularly foregrounded or not centralised or not told are actually brilliant and amazing stories that we need to hear. And I think that's in a way that's fundamental to me, which is that the world's a much richer, more interesting place, and empathy and understanding and generosity is kind of cultivated by opening up those opportunities, quite rightly. I mean, it's just our obligation, our duty to do that. But actually the work becomes much interesting. And not just the work one can see and experience, but actually when you're making work and when you have disabled people within your company, the adaptations that you need to make can enrich the work and open things up, I suppose. And so I suppose on a very basic creative level, it's more exciting, it's more dynamic, it's more invigorating, and it's more inclusive.
Yeah. I would totally agree with all of that. I feel like I think one of the things that's been so brilliant as well about the last few years and the journey that we've been on is also the kind of the wealth of disabled artists that are kind of coming through and part of making that work. And I think that's really important for particularly non-disabled theatre makers, organisations who aren't necessarily led by disabled people, is to make sure, when we look back at the brilliant work of Grey Eye, Unlimited, Mind the Gap, all of these brilliant companies. What we've got to remember is at the heart of those companies are disabled people who are leading that work, who are advising on that work, who are kind of driving it forward. Like, we couldn't have gone on the journey we've been on over the last few years without the expertise, the ideas, the creativity, the innovation, the generosity of spirit, the kind of teaching of so many brilliant deaf and disabled artists. And I think it's really important that wherever we go in terms of the journey, that gets more and more respected and remembered, because I think there's a real danger that this kind of like, this exciting new way of making theatre, it's like, well, it's not new, people have been doing this for a really long time, so we have to like absolutely remember we're standing on the shoulders of absolute giants, like people like Jenny Seeley that Jay's already mentioned, but also that actually I think where it feels we absolutely need to be heading, and we're not there yet, is how are we making sure that in the end the people running buildings who are doing our jobs, who are directing on the biggest scale if they want to, are also disabled people themselves. And so I think that's absolutely kind of, you can't make that happen overnight.
Talking about journeys, Ramps on the Moon. So so that's been going for 6 years now. I think it's 6.
7, right?
6 or 7. The reasoning behind it was to get our artists with disabilities on our stages, and for mainstream organisations to accept disabled work. So why did Leach want to actually be part of that?
Well, I've already mentioned that actually the day of one of my interviews, maybe my second interview for this job, there was a huge symposium that Scottish Dance Theatre had organised in Dundee. It was a 2-day symposium for the dance sector, looking at disabled artists, training of disabled artists, dancers particularly. And I remember having to do the speech the night before and then not be there for the second day because I came down here. And I remember Matt Fraser was the compere, who was typically, what's the word?
Typically Matt.
Typically Matt. And he said some very direct things to the assembled room. I think I was the only director of a theatre building from the UK at this symposium, which had about 250 people there. Now, it was in Dundee, and it was my theatre as part of what we'd organised. So I'm not claiming that if it'd been in Penzance, I would have been there. But it was interesting to hear and see and take part in the discussion of brilliant people from across the whole of the UK and some international, not just dance, but dance and theatre. And that's an example, I suppose, of what I've already mentioned, that when I was in Dundee, the Scottish Dance Theatre model of having an agent changed. Caroline Bowditch, she's a wheelchair user, and she was really influential. And it wasn't just her, actually. There were other projects that Janet Smith had put together, which had sort of started to get me much more aware of this area of practice. And as I started to become more aware, and this is in the early 2000s, these things were sort of rattling around my head, and I was really proud of the work that Scottish Dance Theatre, which is part of Dundee Rep, had led on in the dance sector. And so when I got this job, I was kind of like, I'd been really influenced, I suppose, by the value and the significance of that work. And actually, I remember going to see Reasons to be Cheerful when I was still in Dundee at Stratford East.
And then when it was Strephany Opera as well, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, that Reasons to be Cheerful was then touring. And I was like, we have to get this to come to Dundee. So I think it went as far north as Manchester, and then it came to Dundee. And the audience's reaction to that show was absolutely extraordinary. And then it actually came to the Playhouse as well, because it went on the subsequent tour. And I think Pete and Sarah from Ipswich were very involved in that as well, in terms of New Wolsey. And of course, they were kind of key people in terms of along with Jenny from Grey Eye, in terms of developing the Ramps on the Moon notion. So I can't remember why, but we were one of the theatres that were part of the original conversation. There were 7 originally, but only 6 managed to get involved in the final sort of consortium bid, and Grey Eye as well. So we were founder members, as it were, along with the other 5 building theatres and Grey Eye. And like I say, I mean, a lot of it is on a personal level felt to me a perfect opportunity. It was an absolute sort of no question for me that this would be a brilliant thing for Leeds Playhouse to be involved in. I have to say, having sort of signed up for it, others here have done a huge amount of work to make it a success here, and particularly since Amy's been in post, has just picked it up and run with it and done amazing work. But the strength that I think that those theatres within the sector have got from working together, and from the challenges and the opportunities that have arisen over that period of time, have been, I think, groundbreaking. They really have, and I don't think we would have got anywhere near as far without that project.
And Amy, like, James is mentioning a lot about your experience with Ramps, because you directed Oliver Twist.
I did, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about that experience, and what have you learned during that process? Be really interesting for our listeners.
It was interesting. I was having a catch up with Michelle Taylor, who's the director of change for Ramps on the Moon, the other day, and I was getting quite emotional actually talking to her about the thought of phase 1 of Ramps coming to an end in March next year, because I joined the Playhouse, like James says, it had been going for a couple of years by that point, but I'd seen all of the Ramps productions, and I think you can't help as a director watch those productions and see the kind of creative challenges of like all of the access requirements, all of those different layers of access that needs to be present creatively every show. And I'd sat through all of the other Ramps shows going, God, that looks really hard, and what on earth would I do if I was to do it? But also being kind of like, I'd quite like that challenge, that looks really exciting, because actually one of the great things about being a director is challenging yourself to do things that you don't know how to do, hey, because that's how we make better art. And also obviously within my role at the time as associate director, kind of very much kind of starting to join our Ramps on the Moon meetings, working with our agents for change, your predecessors, Paul, and starting to kind of get really involved with it. So I think there was just a sense for me of like, wow, what an amazing project to get to deliver when it gets to be our turn to do our Ramps on the Moon production. But I also, I think, got a real sense of like watching it of how many layers of challenge there were, and that I wasn't ready, that actually despite I'd worked with disabled actors before, I'd worked in participatory contexts with lots of disabled people, but actually there's so many elements that I just hadn't really practiced. So I needed to get practicing. So I think that was the really fundamental thing for me, was that I knew I had a good couple of years before our Ramp show was on the horizon. So I just thought I just need to treat every show I do between now and then as an opportunity to pack on the muscle ready for Oliver Twist, because I knew it was going to be so massive. What I didn't want to do is get to like the first day of rehearsals, be stood in that big circle of meet and greet and be like, I don't know how to do this, because that's not also going to help those artists involved do their best work if I'm not ready for it. That would be me letting them all down, because I wanted to take it on and prove that we all should be doing this work, because I was aware it's not just about me packing on that muscle, but about us organisationally packing on muscle. So how do we get our stage management team ready? How do we think about the marketing side of things? So that's really the journey that I went on in terms of prepping for Oliver Twist.
Oliver Twist, well, that's experience all to itself. What was that like, trying to also work out the pandemic and the legislations or what you had to put in place?
Yeah.
But also for you, James, because it must have been an experience for you having to also work around what the Playhouse were doing with during the pandemic as well. And I want for you first, Amy, and then from you, James.
I mean, I think we were lucky that when we made Oliver Twist first time round, I remember actually driving into a tech rehearsal actually, which would have been in February 2020, and saying to the sound designer, this COVID thing, should we be like taking any notice of this? Because we were so deep in the kind of, tech week kind of all-consumingness of the show. So I think we were quite lucky in a way that actually we got the show up and running. It had had its press night, we were a couple of weeks into the run by the time the pandemic actually hit, which, because I can't quite imagine trying to do that show and also having the challenge, first time round of the pandemic. Just for anybody who hasn't seen Oliver Twist, it is currently actually still available to watch the film on National Theatre at Home. For that one, it was the first time a Ramps production had commissioned a new adaptation rather than using a pre-existing script. And I think that was brilliant, because what it meant is we could take this classic story that everybody feels like they know at least some elements to the story of Oliver Twist, but we could really embrace the casting. We could embrace the way we wanted to do it in terms of access as well as part of the actual design of the show. And so, for example, quite a number of the characters were deaf characters. So we could really think about the impact of, say, the Milan Conference in 1880 and deaf history impacted on those characters, those deaf characters. We could think about kind of how disabled people were treated both within Dickensian society and now. And we could really put that as part of the narrative. And what it felt like, you know, when we go back to that sense of art, how does it make the art better? I feel like we took this story that everybody thinks they know, and we just found all these brand new layers to it that kind of almost more vividly portrayed the world Dickens was painting in the first place. So that felt really, really exciting. It also meant we could, so Brining Avery, brilliant, you know, very experienced playwright, we could think about how we were going to integrate British Sign Language, integrate visual vernacular, integrate audio description, captioning into the fabric, the very fabric from day one of the production. And that was so exciting because of, you know, it just led to so many exciting discoveries in terms of like what the creative possibilities were. We could also think about the design world. So, you know, thinking about, well, how do you create a visual design that's also accessible to a lot of blind people, you know, and how can we make characters, you know, I remember like finding like Nancy had jangling bangles, so you could always know when she was on stage, for example, these details that make it better for everybody, but were really accessible. So that was really exciting. Then, yeah, we had the pandemic, which was, we were such a family. And I think one of the things about Oliver Twist, I asked a couple of questions on the kind of second day of rehearsal of everybody. And I can't believe I've not been asking these questions at the start of every rehearsal period ever. But I just asked everybody to share, what do you need to do your best work? And what do you need other people to know about you to do your best work? And I asked it of everybody. So regardless of whether you identify as disabled or not, everybody had to check in, because we've all got access requirements, actually. We've all got ways that we can work better. And it was such a great equaliser of a question. But what it also leads to is this level of care for each other in a space, you know, a kind of layer of generosity that is just so beautiful. That team, I remember the day that we had to say, right, we've got to cancel this big long tour they were all due to go on, and they were such a family. And I remember sitting in this big circle and everybody sobbing because people were heartbroken. So it was actually a glorious thing to get to film it. By that point, we'd been through as a Playhouse quite a lot of projects where we'd had to factor in filming and COVID. So we were quite, again, we'd packed on the muscle, I think, in terms of that. And actually what was really lovely about it was to get to 6 weeks to rehearse a Ramp show is not a lot of time when you like the number of different things you've got to put in the show. Just the translation job, you know, into BSL, for example, could take 6 weeks. So it's a lot to get done. And so even though I was really proud of what we made first time around, to be able to revisit it and just add extra detail was just glorious. Yes, we had to recast a couple of people, actually, because they'd all gone off and got more exciting jobs, to be honest. And that in itself is great, because those are disabled actors off getting work, you know, and being snapped up. And that is a fantastic thing. So it meant we could welcome some fresh faces into that. Maybe the biggest challenge was I got COVID in the middle of rehearsal, so I had to direct via Zoom. But again, anything's possible. I had like the BSL interpreters next to my massive head on a Zoom screen. But it was just lovely to get to revisit it, to be honest, and get to bring that team back together. It kind of gave us a sense of closure, I think, on a project that felt really quite groundbreaking and had really genuinely changed a lot of our lives, myself included. You know, my whole practice has changed as a result of building up to and then the kind of repercussions of that show.
Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting hearing you describe all of that, which is like 5 years' work in 5 minutes. Your preparation for directing that show was like, it wasn't just like a few months, it was like years. You prepared yourself to be the best place to direct that show over a period of time. And I think we were lucky when the kind of close down happened, in that the show had got open at least.
Yeah.
And I remember the opening performances and you know, they were really brilliant and powerful. It was clearly frustrating, but I think the fact that you'd been so careful, the way you'd not just brought the company together and those artists, but also the way the script had been evolved over years. I remember the workshops that you held, and that was partly upskilling you, but also making sure that the script you were working on was the best it could be.
Yeah.
So I think it took a huge amount of care and painstaking dedication, really, to put yourself in a position where you could do your best work. And the fact that it then got made into is on that platform, which we're really proud of. And Amy, you deserve huge credit for it being there. I think, is it the first sort of externally produced show on that platform that isn't a co-production with the National Theatre, but it's standalone? And that's just, and that isn't to say that that people haven't done work like this before or have done brilliant things. That's not what we're saying. But I think for this theatre, you're leading from the front, and the way that the show informed not just the production departments, but the whole theatre in the approach, it genuinely has shifted things here. And it's been really inspiring to watch that work and see the outcome on stage, but also the way audiences responded to it. And really brilliant to see how actors who were cast have gone off to do other things. And, and I think that's part of the point of Ramps on the Moon is to shift the sector.
Yeah.
The pandemic clearly threw huge, huge spanners in the works. But as always, you navigated around them and in some cases actually made the most of the opportunities that set of circumstances presented.
There was a lot of theatres that actually video recorded their shows, and this actually did help the disabled communities actually feel that they could actually go and see the shows without having to risk themselves going out during COVID. There was a lot of talk about how the industry was going to change and like the learnings that we've had. However, it does now feel very much like we're going back into the same old routines. How do you feel about that? And like, what do you think theatres, including Leeds Playhouse, can help change that and actually getting disabled audiences back into the theatres? And do you think that videos and like live streaming shows could still be done in a practical way, but also affordable way?
Well, I think you're certainly right about audiences in terms of the volumes of people turning up. There's definitely a significant effect the pandemic has had. And that's true here and elsewhere. And that's something we need to try and address medium to long term, because what's already a difficult, challenging situation financially is just made worse if people can't come. And I guess we need to try and build back those audiences by engaging people creatively, imaginatively, also think about pricing to make sure that we're not just trying to fill the gap by putting the prices up, because that won't work either. I mean, the filming sort of question is an interesting one. I mean, I'm aware that in a way, out of necessity, through the pandemic, theatres, including ours, did that in a way that we hadn't done much of it before. And I think the benefit of people being able to see that work without having to travel to or spend huge amounts of money on those tickets is a good thing. But the two challenges really are, one is the kind of the quality of the experience that you can offer. That's one thing that we not so much struggled with, but that's what we encountered as we were doing this work. To actually get an experience for a digital audience takes major investment in terms of hardware, personnel to sort of record or capture or live stream, a lot of resource that isn't currently built into budgets. And then the second is, and this is maybe more subjective or arguable, is the quality of the experience that you get by watching it on an iPad or a telly or whatever, computer, laptop. I mean, my view is there were some brilliant examples of that form that came out of the pandemic, but they were pieces of work that were particularly adapted to the digital format. And they may have been theatre, but sticking a camera and just recording a bit of theatre in a theatre auditorium, even if there's some close-ups, isn't necessarily the most interesting way to go. So I think this kind of hybrid model, for me, is the most interesting one. But then I think that takes further investment because the actual form of the piece you're creating needs to be adapted much more fundamentally than just capturing it and distributing it. So I think, and this maybe sounds like an excuse, and maybe it is an excuse, and maybe it's about priorities, but there are particular challenges at the moment across society and for businesses, how you even manage to pay people with the cost of living crisis and with the energy crisis without adapting the form of the storytelling you're used to doing And that isn't a recipe for saying we can't do anything about it, but I think that's part of the context. I mean, it would be brilliant to keep that door of accessibility open so that people who can't come to the theatre can experience what people who can come to the theatre can experience. The question is how we resource that and how we do it in a way which is actually satisfying, good enough.
It was also interesting making, 2 or 3 films in the kind of lockdown period. Kind of, it was such a different skill set as a director, and that was, we managed it, but it's a really interesting thing, and it's a very different thing that you're creating, because I think one of the things that I absolutely adore about theatre is the shared experience of it. Seeing people come together to watch an experience, say Oliver Twist, together in that room with those actors, with that particular company, with that mix of audience, felt so special and so powerful and so political, actually. And of course, you can't quite achieve that when you're by yourself, kind of like watching it on your iPad and getting distracted by the doorbell, So, but I also totally hear you that actually there are definitely things about the fact that we were able to share so much that people could be part of a conversation that maybe they miss out on. And I think that's a big thing as well, isn't it? It's not just about the quality of the experience, but it's also getting to be part of a conversation.
Another aspect, actually, which maybe relates to the financial one, and if our senior producer were here, he'd say this, I'm sure, is some of the challenges we found is the complexity of ownership rights. Who should be credited financially for work. And I think a number of projects we've tried to distribute digitally have not been able to take place because of a lack of a sort of formula, really, for accounting for that, whether it's to do with the unions or to do with the management bodies or to do with the individual artists' royalty. It's a really complex thing. There's a sort of format for you putting a play on and the writer gets royalties and the creative team get paid. But as soon as you get into digital distribution, you're then opening a whole set of relationships which have to have negotiations around them to talk about who's going to get what financially, quite rightly. And I think that also for a sector, that's a lot to then take on board in the midst of just trying to get work happening. So whether that will eventually find a way through and that there'll be negotiations and the format created. But that was another challenge, really.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of challenges that people don't see outside. And I think it's really interesting, that whole point of what you've made about royalties and payments, and also payments around for disabled artists is a whole different ball game around the system. So what show would you both like to direct with a disabled character in a role, and why? And why? There's got to be a reason why as well. So
I'm giving away my secrets here,
There's
Paul.
a few that Amy's mentioned to me that
I know I've got quite a list, but I'm not. I don't think.
Don't mention the ones that are going to be really successful.
Okay.
We want to do them. We don't want somebody else to nick the idea.
Do you know what? I mean, we laugh, but actually, I think where I've got to on the journey that I've gone on is that I actually now find it incredibly difficult to conceive of projects and not think about that as a part of it. So I just find it really difficult now to read a play and not be looking at it through the lens of both what could the possibilities be in terms of disabled casting. Because every single time what it reveals about those characters is so thrilling, so exciting, so brilliant for the story. Obviously, like I did Macbeth, as you know, Paul, earlier this year. We had a deaf Macduff family who used BSL. I mean, the kind of layers and things we found in this, 400-year-old, one of the most kind of well-loved classic plays ever. It was amazing. So why wouldn't you kind of think about that? So I think I find it very difficult now to think of any play without going, and I wonder what would happen if that character had that disability or was bringing that form of communication to the table, or, and also in terms of creative access, I think, again, I kind of can't help but look at plays now and go, this is a very descriptive play already. Perhaps we can push it and make it completely accessible for a blind audience. Or, actually, this is a really visual story. What's the possibility of having BSL within this world? Or really thinking about how text could be part of the design in terms of captioning. I maybe won't kind of do a specific one, because I think in a way it's any show. I've got a whole list in my head, but I'm not going to reveal my secrets here.
And I would say influenced by Amy, really, and encouraged as well, trying to just have as representative a company of whatever piece you're creating. So I remember I did a production of Europe, which is a 6-hander, and we cast Alex Novak in that. who's deaf actor. And I mean, I was much less prepared than Amy was and much less skilled. But it was very interesting. The character isn't specified as a deaf character in the piece, but it opened up a whole set of conversations within the company about what support Alex needed, but also what layers that opened up within the play. It was very, very interesting.
And it's every echo, isn't it? It's every decision you've just described. Then the kind of also thinking about how you support those team members, thinking about then the awareness that it raises within a company of actors, within the creatives, about the kind of how you might change a room, how then that's represented to an audience. It's like I always think like that every seed we can plant can potentially grow.
Yeah.
And what I've been really excited to see is like seeds, actors I've worked with who've then gone off to get their level 1 BSL, or, some actors who set up an audio description company, or, all those ramifications are really exciting. I'm also excited about where we can commission new work, either with disabled writers, so absolutely in the kind of work we've been doing, as you know, through Furnace, all our artist development is around how do we support artists to come through who can be telling these stories themselves, who can kind of be writing these stories themselves. So that's also something that's absolutely kind of on the horizon. And then also, I'm now reading a lot more, kind of expanded what I'm reading. So like, where are the stories out there that kind of have central characters who have a particular disability, or and so how can we also be thinking about that within our adaptations in the future and stuff. So there's I get so excited, I do.
It's kind of like there's
all
two
the
ways.
possibilities.
There's like how to explore, say, a disabled person's experience as a central element of a piece of work, and the lead creatives being disabled artists. But there's also the sort of the representation of society in kind of equitable terms. And I think it's both directions in a way.
Totally.
You can do it by sort of casting Matt as Richard III, or you can do it by just making a company very representative and very inclusive.
Yeah.
I mean, I was speaking to the guy one of the grandparents in Charlie. I didn't know he was disabled. He said that he'd normally kept his disability quiet, and his agent had said, don't mention what you might need. And here he'd been encouraged to say what he needs, and the support has been put in place, and he's doing quite a significant role. And I think it's like one conversation with one person then leads to another conversation, and it's that sense of, and we're constantly learning and wanting to grow and adapt constantly. You've never ever got it all sorted.
No.
But I think it's about being on that journey, as you said, of understanding that the work's richer and better, and the world's a stronger place for that sense of inclusivity, understanding, and empathy, and brilliant stories and brilliant artists whose lived experience gives them something genuinely unique and genuinely striking that needs to be heard.
Talking about new writing, new directors, new producers.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the introduction to producing, directing, and also our partnership that we have with Sheffield Theatres. I helped create the introduction to producing course, and that was because I was seeing not a lot of learn disabled producers out there, and it was getting on my nerves, saying that I was like one of the only learn disabled producers out there. And what we actually are hoping the legacy will be on that kind of project. And after I leave the Playhouse, where do you want that kind of project to go, and what you want to see in the future from that?
So the Playhouse has always done artist development, I think probably since it was first created in 1970. And so I suppose, of course, what we couldn't do is be part of the RAMPS consortium and not also be thinking about artist development. Here at the Playhouse, we think about our creative engagement department, our Furnace work, and what happens on our stages as kind of one big creative ecosystem. We couldn't have driven forward on what we've done with the RAMPS project on our stages without also thinking about those other areas. Obviously, creative engagement, we're kind of quite far ahead. So actually, over the years, I mean, the introduction to that we've just done, that you were part of, Paul, was a really massive, ambitious version of that. But I suppose it grew out of work that we've been doing for a number of years, supported by RAMPS, supported by RTYDS, which is the Regional Theatre Young Directors Scheme. So we had actually done an introduction to directing for deaf and disabled directors about kind of 4 years ago. And from that, quite a number of the people on that course have gone on to do other paid placements and opportunities, been commissioned, and had all kinds of different opportunities come out of that. And we kind of wanted to build on that and grow it, like you say, into areas that we know that there are gaps. Where are the local writers? Where are the disabled producers? So that was very much where that kind of grew out of. And I mean, the actual courses themselves, it was just a brilliant project, wasn't it? And like so impactful for the, like you say, the 24 people involved in participating. But also it's led to, as you know, the creation of a new disabled creative network here in Yorkshire. We had the first gathering, didn't we, a couple of weeks ago, which was fabulous to kind of just welcome so many deaf and disabled people from the area to the Playhouse. And that's going to continue kind of to rotate between us, Barnsley Civic and Sheffield Crucible. And again, it's like, how can we keep on connecting with our partners, with other regional organisations, kind of encouraging other people to join this work and do this work as well. As you know, we've had a fantastic partnership with Mind the Gap over the last few years as well. And that's been transformative, I would say, in terms of our learning journey around how can we support learning disabled actors within professional contexts. So I think we're really conscious of how much partnership working is so valuable. One of the things I loved about the big set of courses we just did was that every one of those courses was run by at least one disabled person, that all the visiting tutors were disabled artists. So there's also that sense of kind of, where are people's role models? Where can people kind of see themselves represented on that next stage of their career path?
That's the important thing of how do people get that step into this industry, because it is a hard industry to get into, disabled or non-disabled,
totally.
And those kinds of courses I think really help. I think there is still stigmatization in drama schools around disabled, so it's making sure that the context is that we're not only looking for disabled artists from like going to like the drama schools. I think it's how do we make sure that those happen outside of drama schools, but still getting the training, because I think sometimes the training is not in place, and then you're stuck and you're not going to be able to perform as well as what you would. I think more courses, more funding, more funding. But yeah, I want to say a great big thank you to you, James, and to you, Amy. It's been great listening to the work that you're both doing at the Playhouse. And yeah, let's carry on the great work from the Playhouse and make sure that more work's happening and more disabled artists and staff are at the Playhouse and finding opportunities. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking us. And just to say, also, your work at the Playhouse has been amazing. It's been brilliant to have you as part of the team, and hopefully you'll continue to have that relationship with us even when your formal position comes to an end, because you had a great influence on not just the thinking, but also on socially and people's engagement, across the organisation. So thanks to you too, and thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. Thank you.
We would like to extend our thanks to James Brining and Amy Leach of Leeds Playhouse, and to Paul Wilshaw for hosting the podcast. We'd also like to thank you for listening, and hope you'll join us next month when Omakemi and Priya Mystery, also known as What's the Big Mystery, chat about sustainability within their arts practices and maintaining good mental health.